Welcome back to LewyT's Amusement Academy. This is part 5, where we will learn about the Paint Trees tab in the Unity Terrain Inspector. After that, I will build the terrain for my slime game and discuss the techniques I'm using. So, the next tab is called Paint Trees. Paint Trees is a little bit like Paint Texture, because you have to click Edit Trees and add a tree. Basically, a tree can be any three-dimensional object in your prefabs. Right now we don't have very many objects, we just have level 1 monsters. But let's go ahead and go to the Unity Asset Store, get some trees. So I just searched for Nature Pack because I remembered having some trees in this low poly simple nature pack. The trees don't look super realistic, but they are free. Thank you, Just Create, for providing a simple low poly nature pack for free. And they kind of match the look and feel of what we're doing. Let's go ahead and get that. Add to my assets and then download. I'm going to import. Okay, now that we've imported, we've got in the project simple nature pack. Here's a folder. Inside there is a prefabs folder. Let's go back to our terrain. Make sure we're on Paint Trees, Edit Trees, Add Tree, and we're going to click on this little circle. And now there is some bushes and whatnot. If we get a lot to go through, so let's just look for tree in the search box. I want to zoom in a little bit. So this little icon that looks like a cube with a slot in the top, and then there's the cube that's just a plain cube. One with a slot is called the model, but the one that's a plain cube is the prefab. So let's go ahead and fix these prefabs so that their color looks right, because right now they're that weird pink. First, let me just find one that I think I want. There's a looks like a pine tree or something. I don't actually see my material here on the inspector, so I'm going to double click the pine tree and then go over here in the hierarchy and find the different places that have the material associated. So LOD 0, it's just got the standard shader. So I'm going to go to the Universal Render Pipeline, Simple Lit. See how that looks. Looks pretty good to me. Let's go back to the terrain. Edit Trees, Add Tree. Click on the little circle. And we're going to search for the word tree. Let's pick the pine tree. Actually, 2 different pine trees. Tree 2 and tree 5. So we'll pick the one that's pink, unless on your computer maybe it's already refreshed and it's the right color, but you want the one that has some color to it. We're still in this little window. So we've selected that. And it says which nav mesh do you want last is probably okay. And we just click Add. Now we have our tree in the palette. I think this is what you would call a palette. On the Terrain Paint Trees tab. Let's go ahead and add another kind of tree. Tree 3, the pink one. And add. Okay. So I'm going to, now that I have the tree added, I'm going to just click somewhere in the terrain. Boom. Now look at that. It made a whole bunch of trees. Now maybe that's more than you would prefer. It's like basically made a forest the size of whatever your brush size is. So you can make a much bigger brush. Just make a huge forest. See if we get over there. Boom. Now, one thing I've noticed is if you make the brush size bigger, it probably paints the same number of trees, but over a bigger space. So the trees are actually further apart when you have a bigger brush size. So let's make a huge brush size, and click once, and there's just a few trees that appear in this area. So you have to play around with that to get the right amount of trees. One thing that trees are good for is, let's say you're in your game, you want to make a maze. You could make your brush size really small. And I'm going to go over here. We just start painting trees, and they're just basically really close together. And we're going to make a maze, something like this. That's a very simple maze, and to save time, I'm going to go grab my character, and move it over here, and then we're going to click play, and let's see if those trees are close enough together that prevents us from just walking through them. Okay, we are in front of the maze. We got to wait for it to finish loading. Okay. There's the... Okay, now let's see if we can walk through them. Nope. Okay, so that's good. That means that they came with a some kind of collider. Now the trouble with these trees is, even though you can't walk through them, you can see through them, and you might be able to figure out the maze by looking. And it's a little bit random, so in some cases there may be a spot where you can walk through them. And here we go. Another thing you can do to make them a little more dense is click on there. Let me get a little bit closer. And keep the density really high. If your brush size is the smallest, but if you increase the density, it puts them really close together. Can't even see through them at that point, probably. Go ahead and do that. Just tracing my existing lines. Oops, made a mistake. Control Z, undo. Now, one thing that this might cause a problem with is you're creating a whole lot of things on the screen, and it might slow down your game if you put too many objects all in the same spot. Okay, here we go. This maze is very dense. I cannot even see through, at least not enough to really tell what's going on. And of course it looks a little bit funny too. Trees being that close together, they don't really grow that close together in real life. So if you're worried about realism, I wouldn't do quite that much density. Okay, so that's your paint trees option. The next button we have is called paint details. It's very similar to paint trees, but there's a few subtle differences, and it can be confusing if you're switching back and forth between the two. So I recommend just picking one of them and using preferably paint trees. Paint details can be good for things like long grass that you just walk through and it doesn't do anything. But otherwise, I would stick to paint trees. The next tab is terrain settings, and it is just a bunch of stuff you don't have to worry about right now. One other thing I wanted to point out about trees and terrain is that, let's say you've already put some trees in your world and you want to change how high the ground is. If you apply a raise or lower terrain brush, it carries the trees with it. So that's kind of cool. You can have independent. You can do one first and then the other. You don't have to do it in a certain order. You might be asking yourself, why wouldn't I just take a tree and drag it into the world like this. Okay? Now there's a difference between a tree done like this. Let's do one of these. Here's a tree that I dragged in onto the ground. And then when I click the ground and I want to paint a tree, I'll paint one of these trees. I will click here and it paints the tree. Now obviously you can paint lots of trees quickly versus dragging objects onto the world. But there's more to it than that. I'm going to move our character over here and hit play. Oh, let's just see if there's any difference in the way it affects in-game play. Here is the tree we dragged onto the world. And here is the tree that is part of the terrain. It seems to work the same way. Right? You can't really tell the difference. But look at these two trees. One is actually a little bit bigger than the other. Not that it's further away. It's literally the one on the left is smaller than the one on the right. That is one of the effects of the tree system. You can make your trees randomly different sizes. Another thing is, like I was showing you before, if you were to raise the terrain, the trees that were painted as trees on the terrain go up with the terrain, but the objects that you dragged onto the world are just stuck in the static position that you gave them. So we'll go down through the ground, and there's our trees that we dragged on, and there's our character, because our character is dragged on. Our character is not a tree. However, the character can move around on the world, but the tree has to be placed where you want it, unless you use the tree system. So that's one reason why you might do that instead of just dragging everything on. In addition to the fact that you can paint a lot of trees very quickly. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and delete these trees. So now I'm speeding up the video. I'm building out the terrain from scratch for my little slime game. First, I'm erasing everything down to 0, and then starting with large brushes, building it up again, and then working toward smaller and smaller brushes. I like this technique to get a good natural looking effect. So what I'm going for here is that the little slime lives on a little island that happens to be a volcanic island. So we're going to build a big volcano in the middle, and then it'll slope down to the water on the outside. I'm using the techniques we've learned together to raise the terrain in certain areas and lower them in others. I'm using different brush sizes, different brush shapes, and different opacities. So at one point I was making all these little streaks down the side of the volcano to imply that there were previous volcanic eruptions where the lava flowed down in lines and kind of give the general look of a volcano that's somewhat active. Then I hollowed out the top, making it lower elevation and putting little spikes around the edge. I know most volcanoes probably don't have little spikes around the edge. I just thought that had a cool look for a video game volcano. I wanted something to use the crystal pattern on. Then I realized that I had not erased the texture, so I was going to do that, and then instead of just erasing, I decided to go ahead and paint the texture I wanted. So I started with sand at the lower elevations. Remember, this is going to be an island, so it's mostly going to be sand around the bottom, and the middle part is already green, but I tried to make it look natural. And then the steeper parts were intended to look like the rocky cliff texture. I had this rocky dirt texture, and so I started filling in different places with that, around in between the grass and the sand. I'm not sure if that's really natural looking or not, but one thing I've noticed with any sort of like graphical design, that the more different variations you can have in like color and light and dark, and it makes a more interesting image. Using different brushes. Then I put some snow at the top. Presumably this is a tall mountain that up at the top it's very cold, except when it's erupting, of course. And then at the very, very top I put this crystal pattern on those spiky rocks at the top. And then down inside the crater I put some lava rocks, where it's like there's some lava in the cracks in between the rocks. Okay, now that you know how to make and change the terrain, you may find it really easy to make a huge mess. By huge mess, I mean a huge mountains that you can't climb, trees are in the way, maybe it doesn't even look cool anymore. In the short term, making a mess is fine because you're learning and practicing. You can always undo your last action, or erase mountains and trees with shift clicking. You can even delete the terrain, but I don't recommend that because it keeps a large file in your computer. In the long term, I want to advise you to be careful and responsible in the way you design your world. You are making a game, and the game needs to be playable and maybe even winnable. That's assuming you are so kind as to allow your players to win. But you also don't want the game to be too easy because that can make it boring also. So use obstacles like mountains and trees and other objects to make a maze or some other set of obstacles where players have to find their way through. So that brings us to the end of part 5. Thank you for learning with LewyT's Amusement Academy. In part 6, we will create a goal for your player to reach and handle the way they can win the level.